Well, that was quick.
I'm on it, man.
How are you, dude?
I do this shit for a living. Hold on.
Yeah.
Let me get.
Well, it normally takes me like 2 or 3 tries. Like I don't know why IG's finicky.
Let me
Wow.
see. I'm trying to get my headset going because you were coming through my phone. Let's see.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it's say something now.
Does it sound all right?
Yeah, it's just coming through my phone instead of my headset, which I guess is fine.
You sound fine. It's
Okay.
pretty clear. Yeah,
Good.
everything sounds clear.
All right.
Yeah, no worries.
Cool.
Cool. How are you today?
I'm good, man. I actually worked on my presentation for our big event. For those who are listening, end of this month in Tampa.
Yep.
Check our Instagrams. I sent out like I think 4,000, 5,000 emails to people I had on my mailing list. I had about 100 people unsubscribe, but yeah, it got out. So it got
Well, yeah, no.
subscribes that I had clicks, but that's okay. Yeah,
It's all right.
yeah.
So what was your topic?
Basically,
I know what it is,
yeah,
but
right,
just
right.
for
What I
listeners.
call it, training mystery. How did I title this thing? It's basically what in the hell's going on? I'm so confused about all these different studies that are trying to tell me how to train. Unraveling the muscle growth mystery: reps, sets, volume, and frequency.
Perfect.
So, yeah, I just get to talk about some of my favorite studies. Basically, I'm going to do it like I did at the one in Nashville, probably, and just I'll get through about 2 slides, and then someone will ask a good question, and then it's off to the races. We'll start talking
Perfect.
about it. Yeah,
Love it. So
yeah.
we can we're gonna softly introduce that topic, I suppose, in today's live, I suppose.
Cool.
So for those of you that tuned in, thank you. We were gonna cover training probably in more of a broad sense, but I kind of wanted to get into a little bit of what that topic was about in terms of just dissecting. Just first off, I think it would be good to maybe like define some of those variables a little bit because I think people mistake what some of these things actually mean and then talk about how they kind of apply in an overall sense because if we look at like your training model, for example, like fortitude training, you're encompassing a lot of different hypertrophy aspects into one, which I think is how we should train for the most part.
Right.
Because if we look at the research, we can kind of prove that everything works in the right context.
Yeah. Yeah. In the right context. It's all
Right.
contextual.
Right.
Yeah.
So before we get into that, if you guys can ask questions too, training questions, of course. What are you doing with your own training right now?
I'm training in my gym, man, like you actually, in my barn. I
Yeah.
have a barn now. I moved. I'm south from Tampa. So I moved obviously at the wrong time given our seminar, but I've got all my same stuff set up in my barn. I got no air conditioning. I got no heat, no nothing. Not that I need heat here,
Well,
but air conditioning.
yeah.
Yeah.
It may be AC. It probably gets hot.
It gets hot as shit, but I don't care. I usually end up training it right in the middle of the day, and
Yeah,
it's just more
dude.
more
I
fun.
train at like 1 o'clock, so summer times when it's like brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
brutal.
But I saw the picture. I saw the vid of you showing how you get your lock open with hot water.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not the best method. I prefer like the torch lighter method because the water just refreezes on the
Right,
lock.
right.
So it doesn't do any good.
It's not good for your lock, I don't imagine.
Probably not. It's a pretty heavy duty little utility lock, so it's all right. It's just like I posted the other day too, and it was kind of a joke. I had did a back workout and I posted just picture of doing like a lat spread and there was a snow drift on my floor that blew in from under my door.
Nice.
It's like there's a pile of snow inside beside me.
My good buddy Mike Gustafson, I don't think he's watching this, but he's one of my best friends. He's actually in my book. I trained with him on and off for years when I was in Arizona. He's from Sweden originally, and the first gym he trained in, he's got so many good stories, man. I'm trying to get him to write a book. You go into the gym, they didn't have air conditioning. Some of the windows were broken out, and literally in the squat racks, the bar was loaded to 2.25 or 220-kilo plates on each side, because if you couldn't start with that, you didn't have any business being in the gym. And you guys would go in to open the gym, and they would shovel pathways through the snow that came in overnight. It would literally, it was that bad. And you know what? Your hands freeze to the bar if you're not careful. I know that. You know, I've had that happen before, training in the cold.
Yep.
All that shit, man. You just go in there and you just got to just dig in and just start warming up, like 10 warm-up sets to get ready to go. Yeah. So
Yep.
something about just, it's kind of you versus gravity anyway when you're going after it. So it makes it even more eventful when it's you versus other aspects of Mother Nature. You got the weather and gravity to deal with.
Yeah. It's a love-hate thing. I mean, there's days like when we had that weather up here where it was real cold, we had those high wind chills and stuff. Granted, the barn blocks the wind, most of the wind, but
right,
it was still like -7 and then like -30 with the wind chill.
Yeah.
You know,
That's nasty.
but there's something about it, like, and maybe it's kind of like a nervous system, like adrenal dopaminergic response or something. But once I got going, I like it, man.
Well, yeah.
Like, it's like, I just want to run through the fucking wall, you
Right.
know?
I'm
I'm ready.
Yeah, I know that. Yep.
Yeah, so, you know, it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
That's fine.
When I was in California, when I was a college professor there, I would train in the morning at like 5 because I had an 8 o'clock class. I had to get in there and prepare. And there was just there was an old barn where I ended up teaching some weight training classes. It was out in the field. And I mean, this is Southern California, so it didn't get terribly cold. But at 5 in the morning, it get cold sometimes, and it was below freezing. And there were a couple times when there was a broken out wind. This thing was just like leftover equipment that some of the athletes trained on, and they just threw some people in there for some weight training classes. And I was in there training a couple times. The sprinkler system would come on and sprayed water onto me, and froze me onto the bar, literally.
That's funny.
But it was just me. Like, I drive up to camp in the dark. There's nobody there. You know, I go out to the barn. I walk out to this field. It's like, I mean, not that it was some Rocky scene or some shit like that, but it's like when Rocky went against Drago and he went and trained out, you know, up in in Russia. It's one of those kinds of things, right? And there's something about it. It's just it's epic, basically.
Yeah.
No other way to. Yeah.
I love it.
Yep.
So let's jump into some training talk. So actually, during my off season, I had a pretty long stint. There was about 3 years since my last show up to this year, I basically used a fortitude training model the whole time.
Okay, I thought you were using DC training, but
so I did for a very brief stint kind of when I talk about, it was kind of phased it and I'm doing the same thing right now. But when I came out of the show, my preps get pretty rough, and I basically come out of the show doing more like low proximity to failure metabolic type work. You know, you can really like leverage those pumps and you know, because especially when you've starved for months on end, you know, you're so sensitive at that point. I mean, I'm getting a pump like brushing my teeth.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
back into things because you're just water balloon, all that kind of stuff. Yep.
So I generally post-show, I generally leverage that as long as I can until I start to feel better, and then I'll move back into a little more like progressive overload type of stuff later.
Right. But
once I got deeper, maybe 8 months into that off season, then I kind of switched over to that model where it was basically 4 days a week, and I had two loading days and then 2 muscle round days. Okay. Now I split it up into, I was splitting it up into like allocating volume to weak muscle groups and stuff. So it wasn't necessarily like upper lower or something like that. Back had a lot more volume, arms had a lot more volume, but it was still like a 2 loading, 2 muscle round days. And I found that I could train. Here's the thing too, over the years, I know I know there's a lot of research too. We're talking about like proximity to failure. I could probably add another day of training if I back down a little bit in some aspects. But I also like to just fucking do what I like a little
Yeah,
bit at the same time,
absolutely.
you know?
Yeah.
So I probably sacrifice a little bit there, but it is what it is. So let's go into that research a little bit. So as far as dissecting those variables of our main variables probably being volume, tension, and what would I guess the third variable would be like metabolic waste or like, cell swelling, sarcoplasmic, whatever.
Yeah, well, we got stimuli. You've got Brad Schoenfeld's, sort of classic model that he put together in like 2011 of muscle damage, metabolic stress, and tension. Tension being the primary
Yep.
thing we're focused on. And the interesting thing about that people sometimes miss is now we have these high rep, low load sets that are 30, 40, 50%. And you get, at least in the short term, just as much muscle growth from those as training with 70 or 80%, especially
Right.
to failure. So the interesting thing there about just the tension aspect is when that tension doesn't have to be like, 80%. You don't got to be doing 8 to 10 rep max sets, although those work really fucking good
Right.
as well. People don't train that hard. But literally, if you think about what most people do during the regular day, they're not picking up something that's probably over 20 or 30% of a one rep max, hardly ever.
Right.
People don't move around. And even if they do, they're not doing contractions where it's a full concentric and eccentric the way we would in the gym anyhow. So to get above, and this is what we don't really know, but basically got to get above like 20, 30% of a one rep max in terms of load. And then you're in the stratosphere, so to speak. You're in the zone where that's enough tension as long as your volume is enough and as long as your effort level, so the reps in reserve or the number of effective reps you produce is enough, then you're going to be able to grow from that. So if you just do one set and you leave 4 reps in the tank, it's probably not going to be enough for most people. So you may need to do 3, 4, or 5. So you got the stimuli that are there, and those, the metabolic stress thing. The interesting thing about that is basically now we know that metabolic stress is just telling us about the extent to which fatigue is provoked. So you can do even lower loads, some of the blood flow restriction stuff, especially with elderly people who've been injured. You can just do walking on a treadmill with a band on the legs. You'll get muscle growth just from the walking. But what happens with metabolic stress or with the blood flow restriction model is you produce this metabolic stress, so you fatigue those fibers and you alter, even these very low loads, 30% of one rep max, you alter the activation strategy that's used. So you start calling upon the higher threshold motor units, the more the type 2 muscle fibers, and then you get them involved, and they're not producing massive amounts of force. You take a set of with a 30 or 40% rep max load to failure. Let's say you do 30 or 35 reps. You're still only using a very, very light load at the end of that set, even in those high threshold motor units, but they will grow. They definitely, you'll definitely get good growth there. So the metabolic stress per se, in fact, there's one study where one of the things they did is they trained both arms, and one arm just did the regular sets, and the other arm they applied a cuff immediately afterwards to produce metabolic stress for like 2 minutes. So you can imagine you get done with your last set and you've got the most blood flow. You put a cuff on there, like you're going to get a hell of a pump there. So they just applied metabolic stress without any contraction, without any load associated with it. And that, at least they divided their subjects up statistically in terms of the men and the women. And for the women, that actually had a negative effect on growth. So the metabolic stress, who knows? You can get it. It could have been a couple of different things. It may have been an increase, may have been too much free radical stress. You can get a reperfusion injury that comes from something like that. So the metabolic stress is just basically it's one way of thinking about. Did you get a good pump? Does it hurt? Right? And that tells you that you're activating the fibers that you don't necessarily activate if you don't train very hard. The muscle damage thing, that's important too, because we know if you look generally at the studies and this is kind of like meta-analysis level view of things, that eccentric contractions are a little bit better than concentric contractions, kind of compare volume It's difficult to do because of the activation patterns being different, but eccentrics produce more force per unit muscle mass. In fact, a lot more force depending on the speeds of contraction you're comparing, and they seem to produce better growth when you equate everything else out. But they also produce more damage. So all those stimuli fit in what I always talk about, our hormesis pattern, where you add volume, you add dose, you add more stimulus, and you get a better response until you would reach some plateau. And then you keep doing too much. You do 20 sets. Maybe that's for you, that works. That's your best. For you or someone who trains like you and me, 20 sets a week of a muscle group to failure is just not going to work. That's way too much for me. That would just, I mean, I would do it and I would survive it just because I'm knuckleheaded, but it would not right? And eventually you do 20, 30, eventually you get to the point of diminishing returns and you keep doing that and you're going to go in the hole. So we've got this dose response curve, which is probably in an inverted U. If you look at there's a view from Wernbaum, 2007. He suggests that, looking at all the data he put together. But you look at like Schoenfeld's study that he got a lot of shit for when they're doing up to 45 sets. You don't get to this point where you're seeing like the curve come back around. There were a couple studies that actually were withdrawn because the data were faked that showed that hormesis type of curve, but that was a Brazilian graduate student who was faking the data. So that's a whole other study, another story. He was trying to like support what he wanted. But it's certain. I mean, I don't see how it can't be true. It's not that someone could just do 100, 120, 150 sets a week and they wouldn't eventually, drive this into the hole. That's absolutely the case. Right. So volume is important. In terms of program parameters, now we're talking about volume, frequency. The most important thing is actually what a rep is for a given muscle group. So and that's the most important. Like, what's their single unit of stimulus? So yeah,
let's take that. Let's break that down a little bit, because there's a couple things in there that I think people get confused on a little bit. So like effective reps, talk about that, and proximity to failure. And I think you could even break that down further and talk about effective reps in an advanced trainee versus a novice trainee, or effective dose in an advanced trainee versus a novice trainee. Like I always say, like if we had a line graph and this is like anything under this is under training, like not enough stimulus, and anything over this is overtraining, that novice has a pretty big line, right? Whereas this advanced person, they've got about this much space to work with, right? Where like anything over here is too much, anything over here is not enough, right? So that's where I think people get kind of confused. Like when we're talking about, a lot of people came out and started talking about proximity to failure and effective reps, and it kind of became an excuse to not train hard enough for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so there's so much to unpack there. First thing is that untrained individuals do not do a good job of really knowing how many reps they have left till they fail. You probably heard that. They just don't. Once you get more trained, you can actually do that. And what actually constitutes voluntary muscular failure is going to vary a lot depending on the person and how willing and how long they've been training and how willing they are to push themselves. If you've got a gun to your head, it's a different scenario. There's so many of these, like for instance, Brad's study. There's another study that I was just looking at today. I got the PowerPoint pulled up there right now. They did in one of the groups. They were looking at, in this case, just the quads, the vastus lateralis, and the two exercises that constitute training for the quads were squats and knee extensions. And just for the squats, and they had a dose response that was basically a straight line, covering 16, 24, and 32 sets a week. Untrained people, right?
Right.
These sets were all taken to failure, 10 or 9 to 12 reps to rep max. In the 32, they were training twice a week. So each of those sessions, and which 32 was 8 sets of squats to failure and 8 sets of knee extensions to failure. So,
right.
Just like you going in and you're doing 8 to 10 rep maxes, like true rep maxes where you literally fail. you don't get the last rep. You got to, the weight has to be brought up for you. You do 8 sets of squats on a Monday, and you come back and don't even think about the knee extensions. You come back on a Thursday and do 8 sets of squats like that, and you try to do that for eight weeks straight.
Maybe with an unloaded bar.
Yeah.
By the third set.
they're not fit. But if you don't unload bar, then you go to failure. Then you're doing like 500 rep sets. These are 8, and they're adjusting the weight, of course, and that makes it even harder. If you started with a 10 rep max, and then you did, a set of 10, and then a set of 8, and then it was 5 and 4 and 4 and 4 and 4, something like that. That'd be less volume. It'd still be brutal, but they're dropping the weight down. So if you start, let's say you're using whatever 495, and then the next one you drop down to 405 because you give yourself 2 minutes rest, and then you got to go to 365 and 315, and then 275, 275, 275, and 235 or whatever. And you're trying to progress that over 8 weeks. And these athletes actually did that. And I'm accentuating this point because these are newbies. That would be for you or me or many people probably listening to progress with that volume, actually take into failure, doing reps that are for failure for you or me or many people who are advanced. It would be absolutely asinine. There was no way that they could even execute that program because they couldn't progressively overload, because they couldn't get stronger. There'd be so much damage and muscle soreness coming in to that second session after the first one, and then the next one, it would just accumulate, and there literally would be overtraining, probably within 3 or 4 weeks, I'm imagining, for most people, because overtraining defined as a reduction in performance. So the point there is, to some degree, that I think many of those trainees in these studies, even if they're trained, or many of them can train hard. You probably had beginners or people you've worked with who they've got an athletic background, so they're technically untrained, or they're just gritty and they train really hard, right? So those people still, there's going to have to be some sandbagging to actually call those sets failure in many cases.
Yeah.
So what constitutes a rep in those sets is highly variable depending on the training status, the individual, various other things. So that there's so much variability there. Now if we want to get to effective reps, so if you think about those sets, failure to non-failure, there's some studies actually looked at those. In terms of untrained people, doesn't seem to make much of a difference, failure to non-failure, right? And Schoenfeld came out with a new meta-analysis. Gurgic is the first name on that when he does most of those with him. And they had like a little bit of a subgroup analysis where they did find that for muscle growth, training to failure was better in the trained individuals, which is something that like John Meadows had always mentioned to Brad, and Brad sort of thought, yeah, I think it may be the case. He kind of suspected that. And it's because when you first start training, any kind of training is effective. Your reps are effective. Not if it's just 5 reps away from your failure point. You could do all your sets and have literally some of those untrained trainees, when you ask them how many reps they have left, and they say, 2 from failure, and you encourage them, they'll get another 10 or 12, right? But some of those people will still grow that way. So effective reps when you're untrained are a totally different picture than when you're trained. When you're trained, and this is sort of the thing that has been the model I've kind of been developing in my head and have talked about various times, is that in order to get anything that is an effective rep, in meaning that it pushes you to a higher amount of muscle mass, it produces an adaptive response that you can take advantage of as long as you recover and eat enough. That becomes, like you're saying, there's a very small window there, and you have to train really hard, and you're probably going to have to take some of your sets to failure, and your sets that aren't to failure would have been several reps beyond failure, and maybe an average person is not as motivated as you. And the problem then becomes that now you're pushing yourself so hard that your limiting factor becomes your nervous system and various other things, maybe your joint skeletal system. So your effective reps, the window in a set to gain effective reps becomes very small, and your chance to recover, your risk to benefit becomes less advantageous, because you're risking overtraining if you try to accumulate too much of that and stretch yourself, because you can't recover from it because it's too much. So yes.
So let's take. So I'm going to keep breaking these down a little bit more. So let's talk about failure in and of itself, because So we've kind of established that gauging failure is a difficulty definitely for newbies, even for some people that aren't new. But there's also different ways to gauge failure. So you use the word voluntary failure, all right? But there's also, like, I like to look at it in terms of hopefully we're not just utilizing voluntary failure. Hopefully not, right? Hopefully we're looking at things like technical failure, like maintaining form in the set, mechanical failure, right? And then if you wanted to go even further, you talk about like eccentrics. You could have like eccentric failure and like all these other things. But I kind of like to use the terms like technical or mechanical failure to show we're still performing reps that maintain good form, but you can't move the weight anymore, because kind of what happens too, and you'll see this especially in programs that are solely based around progressive overload, is like if you watched a video like of a squat from a side angle, you'll see manipulations in form to shift to different muscle groups because the primary muscle group, maybe a quad focused squat, is failing. So you unconsciously are compensating by shifting your hips back, opening your legs up, adductor, all these things. And now you're progressing just by virtue of training a different muscle in the same set. So like when you talk about failure to people, is there a way that you kind of like illustrate that, like what it should look like?
So I like the way you define it. They're advanced. This is another awesome topic because there's so many interesting nuances to it. So once you would start to see those shifts, let's say let's take the great example of someone squatting, where they're starting to get more low back involved, and you can tell that they're making accommodations in how they execute the rep. You might say they've reached technical failure. And the thing is that the causes of those technical failure, it might just be that they're psychologically unaware of what they're doing, or maybe that's for them. That's their let's call it psychologically weak. They're unable or unwilling to maintain form, right? And to continue the rep, with the form and same activation, because you're going right into the point where you're going to hit failure, and it's kind of like you're running right into a wall. So the interesting thing there, and this is what I don't know, this is something I think is probably variable. This is where I think, like, if we take like a really kind of extreme sort of set, like a Widowmaker, you're going to have people who start off Widowmaker who are just highly motivated, and when they start making those shifts, like they go to they first are taking rest between their reps. They're not doing continuous reps during the set.
Tempo changes, all these things, right?
Right. So they start off real fast. They're just trying to get the reps. And they might be actually someone who they start to incorporate, like the strategy they've learned. They've literally gotten to technical failure, and then they do it like a doublet of reps. And in this case, they're trying. This is a quad exercise for them, and they've set it up with their foot stance, and maybe they're on a Smith machine. They've made it into a quad exercise for them. But the way they're cheating is allowing themselves to do sort of a forced rep, essentially. So they're still getting, because they're so motivated, they're still getting a really good targeted activation of the intended muscle group, the muscle they're trying to train. And now they're giving themselves some assistance in the way they're cheating with their form. And then when they finally break down, it's because there's nothing left. Their low back is out, and their hamstrings are out, and the glutes are fatigued. So they've hit technical failure, so to speak, where they couldn't continue and get another repetition and up and down movement without adding in those accessory muscle groups. And what they've done then is they've gone to failure, technical failure essentially, and then they've done five forced reps, although they didn't have anyone helping them with the forced reps.
Right. Yeah. Their hamstrings help them force the reps.
Yeah.
And right. So that brings me to another good point, and this is something that I've had to adjust. And I mean, you've been training a lot longer than me, so you'd be able to chime in on this. Is like movement selection, even when you're getting into advanced trainees, because we're talking about things like the ROI on that movement, and how, like, so things like, should you do braced versus unbraced movements if you're using heavier loads and you're more advanced? Is that like a better way to target certain tissues and stuff, because you see a lot of arguments with this in different ways. And I know for me, I've had to divorce myself from some things that I enjoyed doing.
Yeah.
I'll give you a great example. Like posterior chain, like hamstring, glute stuff training, I could RDL a shitload of weight, right?
Huh?
But just the fact of like loading it and unracking it and shaking to death to like get into position to like execute the rep
Huh?
was the ROI and the CNS fatigue alone. I have to start thinking, well,
Yeah.
how much am I able to actually put into like contractile force during this set, or am I just toasted before like racking and unracking the weight?
Yeah.
You
Jordan
know?
posted something on this. I just happened to see it on Instagram today, and he was talking about kind of the very same thing. He had a PR, I think, of this body weight for an RDL, and I forget the weight and the reps. And he noted in his post the same thing you just brought up, is that he's at this level of strength, he could be moving more weight just doing a regular deadlift. But in terms of bang for his buck and in relative stimulus for his posterior chain relative to his nervous system, RDLs is what he does in this case. And he's not
Right.
talking anything out of that kind of thing either. So everyone kind of has to decide that for themselves, I think, to some degree. The thing that I'm in favor of, and I hear you, is that you build grit and you build sort of the ability to just create central drive and really just destroy a muscle and don't run into a central limitation in terms of how much you can voluntarily activate a muscle by doing the hard ass lifts, by doing deadlifts, by doing rack deads, by doing squats, those sorts of things. I mean, biceps to failure is absolutely nothing when you've got a decade of dealing like this. It's right. So, but eventually you run into that issue. And this is that give or take that I was just talking about, is that you've got a given amount of central nervous system stress that just takes its toll on you relative to the bang you get, the return on investment, the bang you get for the buck, for whatever muscle you're trying to target there. So you have to figure out how much of that you can incorporate and get away with. And that's partly why I set fortitude training up the way I did, is because you got those heavy go-to sets, the compound movements, the ones you do in DC training, the ones you do with the loading sets with, but you can't keep banging away on those things. But you can target those muscles and continue to create an overload that you can move through and recover from by doing like the pump sets or muscle rounds and choosing the exercises. And it's done in auto-regulatory fashion. So you'll kind of know, like, not every week is the same. You could be following a program and fatigue can accumulate, and all of a sudden, who knows, like you helped a friend move, worst case scenario.
Environmental something, right?
Happens, right? Your cat gets out in the middle of the night and you have to go find it and you don't sleep very well. Committed millennia things, right? And so then you're left like, okay, so what do I do today? Do I want to pick, when I'm going to do a muscle round or one of these non-straight set loading, like heavy go-to-it type of exercises, type of sets, in my case with fortitude training? Do I want to do a bent over row, or do I want to do like a braced machine row? And in that case, you're like, my low back screwed. I was moving a bunch of stuff around. I just don't feel like it makes sense. You still train as hard as you can, but the relative central nervous system taxation that you get with those is minimized. So you can auto-regulate that, so you can come back to fight another day, basically. But you still create stimulus.
Right.
That I learned, I mentioned this on podcast too lately, is some of that pump set stuff, and maybe you've had the same thing. I learned from injuries I had in two cases, for instance, with triceps, small tricep tears, where I was coming back from that, and I was just doing high rep stuff, which meant lighter loads, so I didn't want to exacerbate a tear that was healing. And when I got done with a couple month and a half, 6 weeks of rehab, I'm like, my triceps look better than ever. And I just hadn't been doing those high rep sets before. It's a novel stimulus. And I'm like, these actually work really well. So I'm like, this should be part of the program. So that's partly what I learned. So people who have been just banging away with the big exercises for the heavy weights, it's a novel stimulus. And it's still in that loading zone, right? 30, 50% of one rep max. That's still enough stimulus. It's a matter of activating in the right amount that you can recover from and training hard enough, but leaving your nervous system alone at the same time.
Right. And And there's some benefits to, we can go into that setup a little bit too. So there's some benefits to things like the muscle round, which is essentially like a cluster set, right? It's like you're getting quite a few effective reps because as you progress through that set, you're training close proximity to failure, like especially the second half of that muscle round,
Absolutely.
you're getting a lot of reps in that effective zone,
Yep.
right? So maybe talk about how that is beneficial. I think because for advanced trainees, I think that is very beneficial, especially because, you're not having to get through reps 8 through 12 to train reps 13 through 15
Right.
that are effective, right?
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, if we think like, let's take like a 12 rep set and then compare a newbie to an advanced person and talk about effective reps, just generically, the newbie they might have a stimulus if they took that set to 9 reps or 10 reps. They might have had 2 or 3 reps that were an effective stimulus. But if the trained person is using more load, and we've got a law of diminishing returns applying here, they've already got more growth. They're not going to get anything if they leave 2 reps in the tank. There's nothing left. So they have to do more effective reps. That 11th to 12th rep matters. So that's what the cluster set does. And the way I set up the muscle rounds, and I stole this from Leo Costa. I just liked how he had 6 sets of 4. That was nice. There's nothing necessarily magical about that. You could do 4 sets of 6. There's myo reps. There's DC training, which is a little bit different. There's all sorts of configure those things. And I've done that in my own training too. I've done 5 sets of 5 before.
Yeah.
That's totally fine. But the main idea there is volume does matter. It's not to say that, those first 8 reps are absolutely meaningless, because they do accumulate some volume and there's some activation because there's some tension, especially in the low threshold motor units. So they're not like, you don't want to just throw them totally out. There really be no way to do that. But when you do a muscle round, for instance, it's sets of 4, or at least trying to get sets of 4, and you're doing 6 of those. People like to say it's just 6 sets of 4. Well, it's not exactly. You start with a load where you can do a set of 4, take 5 rests, rest 10 seconds, so your work to rest interval is about 1 to 1. You do a set of 4, rest, a set of 4, rest, and then in that 4th, 5th, or 6th set of the muscle round, you would fail. So the way that works, let's say you get your first 2 sets of 4 not too tough, and that 3rd set of 4, that 3rd and 4th rep were pretty hard. So those would be effective, right? Now you rest again. So you can come back in that next set of 4, and the first rep maybe not, but the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rep are effective. So now you've got the first 2 and those other 3. You've got 5 effective reps. Then you rest again, and now you go into the 5th set of the muscle round, and now you do 3 reps and you fail on the 4th one. So now you get 3 more effective reps. You're going to do 6 sets, so you drop the weight down. This is the nice thing about the muscle round. Only 1 failure point, and you pick a weight between 10 to 30% of what you've been using. You drop it down. It's nice to have that planned out ahead of time, so know what your drop's going to be if you're using a bar and plates. Sometimes you're like, oh shit, I didn't think it out. So something around 10 to 30%, so you can get the next set of 4 without failing again. And basically that means that you're probably going to get 3 effective reps out of that, because you didn't drop the weight in half. They're not just, just do 4 more reps. Those are also hard, but my thought is, and this is sort of the premise that I picked up on years ago, and you may have seen this in your training, is if you're going along training and you're not reaching failure, but then you actually hit a set where, let's say, your goal reps are a little bit higher than what you can get, then you hit failure, there's a dramatic impact after that. You will, if you're going along doing sets of 8 and all of a sudden, like, you get to a set and you got 8, 8, 8, and then you get a set of 7 and you fail on 8, the next one's going to be 5, right? Unless you rest a lot. So there's a massive inroad into your recovery, and I think this is a nervous system phenomenon that comes from hitting failure. The positive is you're training really hard. You have a marker of progress, so I got 3 reps in that 5th set of the muscle round. Next time I'm going to try to improve upon that so I can have some sort of progressive overload. But I'm not going to then do another set of failure with that same weight, but I can accumulate effective reps, which are indeed effective, without having that sort of negative, not so great benefit to impact on my nervous system that comes with the failure rep. So then you got 2, 3, 3, and then let's say 3. So we add up, if those are the, I'm just calling this, who knows what exactly effective rep would be, but you got 2, 3, that's like 11 effective reps. At what
Right.
that would be, I think 23 reps if I added up right in my head.
So you almost 50% of that cluster, roughly, yeah, or arbitrary numbers, but almost 50% of that is effective, where that's kind of hard to replicate in a straight set fashion.
With 23 reps, right? So if you did just straight sets in that many reps, you're not gonna get any. Let's say you only had one failure point. You did 8, 8, and 7. Let's say, so that would get you to that would get you 23 reps. Probably wouldn't have that many effective reps in those sets.
100%, right?
Yeah. So that's the idea, and that's what happens with rest pause sets in DC training. So it happens with myo reps. There's pit force training, which is absolutely brutal. I've never seen that before. That's just
maybe.
For anyone who's not done so, Google pit force training and just look for a set of squats. You may have to Google Kniebeugen. It's a German thing. Kniebeugen is squats in German, and you're basically it's like a widowmaker, except you put the weight down, and you just you do squats and you just do some reps, and then you rack, and then you get back under it whenever you think you get some more reps again. You just keep going until you just absolutely exhausted yourself. You're just trying to eliminate yourself, literally trying to kill yourself off. And the sets are just like 10-minute sets. They're absolutely brutal. No, I don't recommend those unless you just someone just did you wrong. You just have to vent, let something out, right? Your girlfriend dumped you. But my idea with the cluster sets is to collect those effective reps. And this was before effective reps were even a term. No one had really used that terminology, or reps in reserve even. When I wrote the Fortitude Training book, that wasn't a term that had come out yet. But the notion was still there. And we know this from just what happens as fatigue ensues, of course, a rep, and it's, of course, over a set. And the better you are, the harder you have to train to make progress. And that happens in those last reps of the set when things are hardest. So
perfect.
Yeah.
We did get, there's a question here. This would be a fun. We could do a couple questions here. This would be a fun one to answer. He asks, do you think maintaining form before you reach technical failure is somewhat of a skill?
Oh, yeah.
So I think it's a choice and a skill.
Yeah.
That's what I always say. I'm
Right.
like, it's a choice and a skill.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely something that, as I've gotten more advanced, that I tried to become hyper conscious of, was, maintaining tension on that muscle that I'm trying to train while I'm doing it. Because like we said, you do make those micro adjustments in form and tempo, and this set at the beginning looks totally different than the set at the end.
Right.
So I'm always trying to, the way I kind of gauge it is looking at failure would be, once I reach that technical failure where I'm consciously maintaining that tension on the muscle, the same tempo, I might allow myself 1 or 2 of those reps with a couple deep breaths, with a little bit of shift in the form, and then that's the end of the set.
Right.
But I'm going to maintain that, where I think a lot of people that maybe don't have that skill, that shift and manipulation happens way earlier in the set, because psychologically they're just not willing to maintain it.
Yeah. Trainers,
so that's,
get clients. That's a lot of times what trainers are doing. It's just making sure they're not futzing around and cutting their range of motion short, or changing their form, that sort of stuff, or just having someone watching you, or even filming yourself for Instagram, right? You don't want the form to come out and get you. The thing that I did with Fortitude Training to kind of, I think this is maybe why it works well for people, is I keep the reps continuous during all the sets, even with the cluster sets. When you're doing those sets within a muscle round, the reps are continuous. So unless you need to shift your weight or change your stance or something's weird, there's no stopping. You're not releasing. You're not locking your knees at the top of the squat, anything like that. So doing that, you kind of develop a pattern, and I think it's much easier when you're doing that, because you're not stopping and just resetting and saying, okay, 2 more reps, and you're thinking about the numbers. you're maintaining your flow, so to speak. And when one rep is not like the other one, it's very, very obvious because you're just going from one rep to another. It'd be like, if I go, does this sound the same? If I go dee, 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 like, yeah, I heard the end there is obvious. The tone change, right? If I go deep, deep, that doesn't, it's not quite the same. It's not quite as obvious, right?
Right.
I don't know if people could hear the difference or not there, but so when you take that
Right.
break, that's when you can keep grinding out those different, and then you just switch modes. Like, I'm just in grinder mode where I'm going to get these reps no matter what. And that's like the choice that you've made to break your form for the reps. But I think what I've done, although because like we said before, there's something to say for grinding through a set and maybe shifting form the way an advanced person would to basically do a self-assisted forced rep. Let's say an example of a squat where they're bringing other muscle groups in to allow the reps to happen, which technically the depth is the same, although there's a different activation pattern that's shifting away from target muscle. That's when I put the pump sets in. And those are the higher rep sets, which are much safer to do, and typically with isolation movements. But if you're doing, like, say, a knee extension or something like that, and you feel like, gosh, I'm getting a really good activation here on this particular knee extension that has this cam in it or this range of motion, I want to do like lengthen quad range of motion partial reps here, that's totally fine. That's a wing it, use the mind muscle connection, just try to decimate the muscle to the extent to which it makes sense on that day because you're auto-regulating yourself. And you can grind all you want of those. And a lot of people, especially on legs, I don't know if you did the pump sets and the way you were training that was sort of fortitude training, yes, but a lot of people find that the pump sets for legs are the hardest part of the whole program because you're sort of letting loose. The governor's off, man. So you want to do like a high rep set of like a leg press. You wouldn't do this with a squat particularly. No, I wouldn't suggest that at all because your low back's going to be the issue. But you might get in a leg press and try to do like a 30 rep set, and you maybe get 12. And then you go at the top and you do 5 partials, do the middle 5 partials, go deep and do 5 partials, then try 5 more partials in the bottom, come back out if you can, 5 more partials, go to the top, 5 more partials, and then try to do a really slow negative. If you got a safety behind you, that's basically like a super, like, it's like Tom Platz telling you, like, just 5 more and like just keep going. Okay, do partials. You can do that if that's your mental state that you like to take on. The pump sets allow for that. So that, of course, trains muscle endurance, teaches you how. And the idea there is that you have a good mind-muscle connection. You're not doing those reps by bringing in auxiliary muscles or muscles that aren't your target muscles for that, even if it's a compound movement. You're trying to do that, let's say, for your quads, or maybe you set up to try to make say it's a high, wide, exterior rotated leg press. So you want to make it sort of a glute ham press. You're doing that as a very focused type of movement, but form in terms of full range of motion and that sort of thing, it's whatever you feel like fits what you need on that day. So it's very bro-ish in terms of we're going to just go in there and just hit whatever we want to, but it's fun as hell. And you do it only according to how you've recovered through the week. So if the way you squatted or the way you did your other exercises coming up to that said, I shouldn't do this exercise, you pick the exercise you want. It's totally on the fly. And you fill in the holes in a very instinctive, bro-ish type of way. And then you come back and do your standard progressive overload, destroy the logbook type of thing. Don't cheat. Make the choice not to change your form and have tech. And then that fits in there as well. So the two complement each other, I think. And you have those sets where you're like, I'm going to be strict. I'm not going to futz around and try to get some extra reps because you can do all that you want on those other days. Today's the day where I beat the logbook is my bitch. And that's because I did not cheat in my form. Everything was perfect. I stayed focused. And those other days, you can do whatever you want. Doesn't matter how many reps you get. You can write that down if you want to, but it does make a difference. And the pump sets the way I formulated them. And I think there's something to say for both of those ways of training.
Yeah, and you alluded to this, but there's the movement selection and the safety aspect definitely matters there, like how you're kind of setting that up, especially if you're strong. Yeah. I mean, for anyone, but if you're strong and moving a lot of weight, like that's super important.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, on all those pump sets, it's very often isolation movements machines, that kind of thing. Things where you can really target the muscle, but you're not trying to, let's say, say you've got a bicep curl machine that you really like, and you get a great contraction at the top. You're not trying to do like a perfect set of 15 there. You can do partials there. You can mix that up. If you feel like you're getting, like, let's say it doesn't feel good because you've got some tendonitis starting to develop at the end range of motion. Normally you want to train the length of position when you can, but that doesn't work. You get a stimulus by doing the upper part of the range of motion. That's totally legit. Then you can come back to fight another day. But yeah, you have to be safe. That's the thing about, even with the whole way I've set I think this holds for everyone. If you have a big squat day or a big deadlift day or a big heavy movement day, and you're like, my back feels wonky, I feel like I'm going to slip a disc or something like that, don't do it, right?
Right.
No.
Right.
Yeah. There's just no way. When you get under a big weight like that, and you have like that little, if that fear thing clicks in, which I haven't felt in a long time, but because I've had that, I remember it, and I never want to feel that. That's the wrong day to do that shit. That's like do an Arnold Franco day and go to the beach, something like that, right?
100%. Yeah, and again, like, all that becomes exponentially more important when those loads start climbing up. Like, you got to be in the right headspace to move weight through, that close proximity to failure like that, when you're slapping 4 or 5 sticks plates on the bar for movements. It's serious.
It won't work for some people because they just don't like to do that. Like,
well,
that's just not worth it.
I don't like shit. Half the time I don't like to do it. We could, how we define that, how do we define like, you know what I mean? There's it's definitely satisfying, but
right.
Yeah.
But when every time you actually do it, like you flip the switch once you get in there and you get rolling. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
I half the time my the skill I had to develop was not getting too psyched up before the set.
Yeah.
And blowing my wad. Like, there was a point where like, in some of those loading sets, like squats, RDLs, rows, rack dead, stuff like that, there was a day where I was like, man, I have to change my preset ritual because I got so pumped up that I like kicked this bench and I was fucking bleeding everywhere before I started. Like the guy bashed his head on the bar. I'm like, I'm just bleeding through my pants and I haven't started yet. So it's like, all right, maybe I could add a couple reps to the set if I don't blow my CNS out before I start.
Yeah.
So
curve, an inverted arousal performance curve, and you have to
do some jazz music before on my warm-up sets. Get it, keep that sympathetic tone down for a while.
The thing that I would tend to do is do my initial reps too fast. I get so pumped up.
100%, yeah.
And I'd bang out I'm like, that's way too fast. Not intentionally. Yeah. The range of motion might be a little short. I'd be just so aggressive that I'm like, okay, I can't really count that, And
right, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, I am out of time.
All right, yeah, that's about an hour. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on.
Pleasure.
I would plug you, but I think everyone probably knows how to reach you at this point.
Yeah, fortitude training.
Yeah.
We need to plug seminars on some sort of genetic methylation stuff. What's that all about, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to do, man, that's a really big topic. I'm going to kind of gear it towards, like hormone methylation and like epigenetics a little bit more, like try to make it more applicable to our population. I'll do a little bit on like gene mutations and stuff, but I'm not going to go too far into that.
Okay.
So I think it'll be fun. It's something that I kind of deal with more on like the female side with like estrogen dominant females and liver detoxification and stuff. So it'll be more applicable to that crowd.
Is there a product, Methyl Grow, that you will sell after
No, I will not. I don't have any plugs or discount codes to add to the end of it, but no, it should be good. It was something different. So
yeah,
it should be fun.
The genetic stuff is absolutely fascinating.
Man, there's a lot to unpack there, man. There's I have a lot of, and I don't know that I'll talk about all of them, but I have a lot of theories on epigenetics, like in terms of like weight loss resistance and stuff too. Like people having adaptations, like metabolic adaptations and stuff. But that's a topic for a different day.
Yeah, that was how, as far as I understand, that's how they first figured out some of the mechanisms behind why, like when you starve a mother and then the babies have like this tendency towards obesity. Like
Yeah,
there's a genetic
talking like
effect.
talking, and I've always speculated on long term, even going back to like what's the like I have a wrestling background of weight restriction,
Yeah,
right? Like how did that maybe slightly alter some epigenetic expression over time, in myself,
yeah.
right? And so a lot of it's just stuff that I've just pondered on and theorized, but I'm sure there's some merit to it. There, at least anecdotally, I've seen it.
I want to talk to you about that. Well, I know you got to go, but we'll talk about, because I wrestled too for a couple of years, and I just this last week there were two twins, ironically enough, who I wrestled with, who I looked up online in my high school group, and both of them are very big guys, not muscular now, and I wonder.
And there's definitely something to it, or people that ran like, extreme distance running and stuff for a lot of years. Like, does that have, you know what I mean? So I feel there's probably some correlation, but we could get into the weeds on that when we're sitting there killing time.
All right, man. Sounds good.
Cool. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I will repost so anyone can watch from the beginning if they want, and appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure, brother. I'll see you in a few weeks.
All right. Take it easy.
Later.
Have a good one.
You too.